I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. All right, today, plenty of things going on right now with the government. First, Inez is going to talk about all the drama with USAID. Second, Amber is going to talk about how Mexico and Canada blinked at the Trump tariffs. Third, Ben is going to talk about the Trump effect on immigration. And finally, I'm going to talk about the Panama Canal. So kicking it off, let's go straight to Inez.
Yeah, so there has been a 90-day pause put on U.S. aid funds. And apparently out of the hundreds at this point of executive orders, many of them on very, very substantive and institutional issues, this is what the left has decided to actually galvanize their side and actually try to push back on. So there has been much consternation, both in the media, and then also we have Congresswoman Tlaib and other Democrat representatives, both in the Senate, and screaming bloody murder about U.S. aid. And I wanted to lay out a few things on the structure of this agency and where sort of what it has been doing. And I'll say this up front. I'm new to this subject. This is not one of my wheelhouse subjects, but I was very curious to see how this was structured and went back and read the Enabling Act of 1961 Enabling Act. There's been some amendments along the way. But primarily what enables USAID, which is the agency that simply consolidates essentially U.S. soft power initiatives, right, to support our diplomacy efforts, to support our foreign policy direction. And in principle, I have no problem with this. I mean, soft power is an important element of geopolitics, and certainly we don't want to be in the business of using hard power to try to solve every issue. And soft power can be extremely persuasive in that way. I mean, you only need to look at the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative to see how persuasive these kinds of things can be without having to pull out your military. And obviously, it's good for us to have a counter to that in the world. But this really is a Cold War dinosaur. I was reading this enabling legislation. There are references to the population bomb in this, that hobby horse of the 60s. There are references to when and under precisely what conditions money can flow to communist countries. And those conditions essentially say we have to be moving them away from the international communist conspiracy. So it seems, though, that this is yet another agency, yet another U.S. project or institution that after the Cold War has kind of lost its purpose, dallied around in the 90s and at the end of history, and then settled firmly for the last several decades into being essentially a left-wing international slush fund. And once again, as with all of these kind of pauses and the things that are making the left go crazy about them, the enabling legislation is extremely vague, right? It only lays out what needs to be done with this money under the direction of the State Department and ultimately the president. It leaves a huge amount of discretion to the president in terms of how to use it to support his foreign policy, and the guidelines on what how this aid can be used are on the order of vagueness, like we don't want to displace local self-help efforts, for example, right? So there are these few bullet points, but within those few bullet points, Trump can do whatever he wants with this money. So I think this pause is probably to review all of these left-wing projects, as he seems to be doing department by department across the board. In this case, all of this money is paused until he reviews it and his team reviews it. And I suspect what we'll see is an end to a lot of these left-wing, essentially slush fund projects that go to NGOs in foreign countries to support, LGBT issues and stuff like that. I mean, what was the online thing? The Global American Empire, the GAE, GAE. Unfortunately, that really has that had real teeth. It wasn't just a joke, right? Apparently, this agency has been going around the world, and there has been a very tight connection between U.S. soft power and leftist social engineering goals. We have essentially been the gay empire for quite some time, and this is a key tool in doing that. So this is a great move from President Trump. By the way, I think these pauses, these across the board pauses, have worked very, very well because you see who screams. And even as an engineering concept, right? You want to pull all the feeds at once. You see what's necessary. You plug it back in one at a time, right? And I think that's kind of the mentality with which the Trump administration is going about that a lot of this stuff is, quite frankly, BS or pernicious left-wing slush funds. Pull all the wires out, and then we'll see what is actually necessary as needed and plug it back in. Anyway, I'm curious what you guys think of this effort. This has obviously attracted a substantial amount of attention. I'm kind of happy about that in general. I think it's great to have the left spinning their wheels about USAID and Elon Musk, as opposed to, I don't know, the restructuring of the entire federal bureaucracy. But I'm curious what you guys think about this.
Yeah, in addition to all of the weird gay and DEI stuff, which is completely insane, USAID has also used a lot of these programs as effectively fronts for the CIA, where they use them to recruit political activists from within these countries to help topple governments that the US foreign policy establishment does not approve of. So it's even worse than your typical federal boondoggle, because this has become a sort of independent arm for foreign policy that operates without the express approval of the president and the State Department. So the fact that this is being, in addition to defunded, pulled under the State Department umbrella with Marco Rubio in charge, is incredibly important to making sure that US foreign policy is consistent throughout the administration. And one of the other things that I flagged in looking at some of the programs that USAID was funding was that they were also responsible for giving money to EcoHealth Alliance, which is infamous, of course, for gain of function research, and specifically its funding of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is widely believed now to be responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's even beyond and even more pernicious, I think, than just exporting the left's cultural values to the rest of the world. But also from a general national security standpoint, this is so long overdue. And I think it's fascinating that when we talked on this podcast a few weeks ago about how the general response from progressives was quite muted to Trump's victory, and even the first week or so of his administration, where he was flooding the zone with all of these executive orders, what it finally took for the progressive activist class to sort of get off their butts and go protest was cutting foreign aid, of all things, which I think tells you so much about where their priorities are and why the American people rejected their view of how government should run so soundly.
So my kind of mental model for how the funding works within USAID, and probably this goes beyond USAID, but it's a particularly insidious and nefarious sort of quote unquote independent agency that's been set up, is that you have a layer, and it's probably a thin layer, of legitimate or at least debatable, defensible funding that, to Inez's point, may go towards soft power efforts that we actually think are genuinely consistent with the U.S. national interest. Then you get to the grift / kickback element to it, where you have NGOs that are friendly with the U.S. government, and this is a way of essentially paying them off. There's a censorship industrial complex nexus here that Mike Benz and others have detailed with respect to the USAID funds. There's funding that actually ends up in the hands of our enemies across the Middle East and well beyond. Then there's the color revolution stuff, to Amber's point, where it's sort of this aid organization provides the cover, the funding, the entree for the U.S. government to engage in operations, many of which, depending upon who the administration is, at least in power, end up doing damage and destabilizing the world. And then I think that the other aspect that we have to look at is the entire NGO complex itself. And this is something that is coming into stark relief when we look at freezes across the board and reviews that the administration is engaging in. And I'll talk a little bit about this in my immigration block a little bit later. I think we have to start thinking about the NGOs as an unelected, unaccountable branch of government in and of themselves, where there's the arm's length relationship, which says the NGOs are going to do what they're going to do. and we're going to provide money to them so long as it's sort of in line with what the federal government wants to promote. But in reality, these should be thought of as de facto extensions of the state. So you have the administrative state on the one hand, and this is sort of like another administrative state, which has the plausible deniability of saying it's a non-governmental organization, but it just happens to take government funds and do things that are consistent with the government. And oftentimes there's a revolving door between government agencies and the NGOs themselves. And I think we ought to start looking at them that way. And one of the reasons that I sort of can't come to this conclusion, and I'm obviously painting with a broad brush, because of course there are NGOs that do great things, legitimate things, some of which may take federal funding, and I don't mean to cast aspersions on them. But if we go back to the censorship industrial complex and the Missouri v. Biden case, you had these quote unquote NGOs, third party organizations that were working hand in glove essentially with the US government to surveil social media for wrongthink, pressure the social media companies to change their content moderation policies in line with what the government agencies wanted. And essentially, they were like an extension of the government in executing censorship activities that the government officials themselves would have been prohibited from doing. I think if we look across the board, you can imagine in immigration this occurs, and you can probably imagine it across a whole raft of areas. So I think we need to start looking at this through the lens of, are these extensions of government effectively that are sometimes doing things that government itself is prohibited from doing? And that is coming into stark relief, I think, as we see the freeze in the funding and then who's freaking out regarding the freezes.
Yeah, I am really impressed by this. I mean, it's clear that Elon figured out pretty quickly, like if he got a hold of HR and he got a hold of payments, then he was going to basically have control of the federal government. And that's, I mean, at USAID, it sounds like they basically locked all the current people out of the building and are now going to just go through ruthlessly and get rid of all the spending. I mean, they put it under state. I think there's something there's something very impressive about it. The fact that the left is screaming so much about it, it's like a stuck pig squeals. It's what they clearly, like, they know that we're onto something here. And, there's a massive amount of entitlement here about the idea that they should be able to continue spending money at the discretion that they want to. No, it turns out we want an election. Anyway, I'll pass this on. Next is Amber and tariffs.
Yes, so we have been covering this for a few weeks now. And last week I talked about Trump getting Colombia to capitulate to accepting deportation flights from the US, full of Colombian nationals, by the way, after Trump threatened them with heavy tariffs. And he has now done the same with Canada and Mexico. The tariffs never even went into effect, as many people predicted. Chuck Schumer was crying about Coronas and avocados shortly before they were set to go into effect, because Trump knew, and this was quite obvious to anyone who was looking at this rationally, that Mexico and Canada are far more reliant on the US as a trade partner than the US is reliant on them. The White House sent out a fact sheet with some of the numbers stating that 67% of Canada's GDP is trade, 73% of Mexico's GDP. And then within those categories, about 70% of that trade category for Canada is exports to the US. 80% of that GDP trade category for Mexico is to the US. Whereas the US's GDP that's reliant on trade is like 25%. So clearly there was a lot of leverage here to threaten Mexico and Canada with this 25% tariff. And sure enough, about 24 hours before these tariffs were supposed to go into effect, Canada and Mexico both blinked, both committed to providing military support at the borders that they share with the United States. Canada even implemented a fentanyl czar. Justin Trudeau announced something like $1 billion dedicated to stopping fentanyl at the border and general border security. The Mexican president is sending 10,000 National Guard troops, which is similar to the agreement that Trump had with Mexico during his first term, so that they would have to secure their side of the border. And it just ran against all conventional sort of market wisdom that the government has been operating on outside of Trump's 2 terms, that tariffs were going to raise prices on consumers, that they couldn't be used as an effective foreign policy negotiating tool. That was proven to be false. We'll see what happens with China. They also had a 10% increased tariff on their exports to the United States. They've responded with a retaliatory tariff. It's unclear what exactly they're going to do next, but it's sort of the same setup where China is much more reliant on the US than the US is reliant on China. There's certainly plenty of more friendly trading partners that we could get a lot of these goods from. And for national security reasons, it's incredibly important that we decouple our supply chains from China. This is what Peter Navarro, the trade specialist at the White House, has been saying for the past, I don't know, decade plus, in terms of the fact that we get pharmaceuticals, chips, technologies, emerging technologies from China, and it's left us in a very vulnerable state. So, I mean, even though we are not as reliant on China as they are on us, we still are reliant on them to some degree, and it is a detriment to our national security. So I'll open it up to the group, but I think the fact that Canada and Mexico backed down so quickly, almost immediately agreed to secure their side of the border, was entirely predictable for anyone who's actually been paying attention to this stuff. And all of the fear mongering from the media and the Democrats about how Americans weren't going to be able to get blueberries for their smoothies was just totally debunked nonsense.
Yeah, I think the Trump administration is actually following what must be the only logical course if we want to restore serious power to the United States from a global perspective, which is we need to do both simultaneously. We need to build domestic capacity for some of these critical industries, and also look at transferring supply chains to allies away from countries that are enemies. Like here, I think a good example would be like this is scary enough in itself. I think most of the shipbuilding capability is now in South Korea, not in the United States. Well, that's not as much of a priority. They are an ally, but what's critical is to make sure that China doesn't get that shipbuilding capacity, right? Like, and we need to rebuild our capacity at home while continuing to keep our allies around for some of this stuff that we don't build currently. And it's I think it's going to be a lot of trial and error. So far, it seems to have worked out really well for Trump. These are, to some extent, the small potato countries, right? They are our neighbors, but they it's not the same thing negotiating with China, which, as Amber said, does have actually substantial leverage over the United States, given how much of our crown jewels we've actually sold off to China. So we'll see how that proceeds. I mean, just from the general strategic perspective, it's time for the U.S. to use access to our markets the same way that China uses it for their interests, right? If you want to be able to sell into the Chinese market, the government extracts all of these concessions, many of them like much worse than anything the United States would ever ask for, right? In terms of intellectual property and other things. We also have a huge market that people depend on selling into. And we should use that fact to advance our interests. And it looks like that's what the Trump administration is doing.
Yeah, I think it's remarkable. Like, people, especially like the WSJ types, are constantly freaking out about tariffs and freaking out about like what Trump is doing. And Trump feeds that because he constantly is out there being like, I love tariffs. Tariffs are my favorite word in the English language. I would name my son Tariff if I could. And the whole point of that exercise is to create credibility when he uses them as a negotiating tool. Like, Canada and Mexico have to realistically worry about, is this guy just going to keep tariffs on us indefinitely? Yes, because he actually likes them, unlike the traditional Republicans who, hate them and would never really want to use them long term. So that's part one of it. People don't understand that about his strategy. It's obviously negotiating leverage. And I've seen some people say, well, they just promised to give what they've already been giving. It's like, I think there are some new commitments here. And moreover, this is just a 30-day pause. If Trump doesn't think that Mexico and Canada are, shaping up and doing what they need to do within 30 days, we'll just reinstate the tariffs and get them to make new concessions. And I think ultimately this will be good. It's about time these countries like meaningfully cooperate and stop just completely taking advantage of the fact that they're under our security umbrella.
It just strikes me that we are finally using the leverage that has been there for years, and yet our leaders have basically been engaging in sort of an affirmative action program for the world's notorious regimes, for tin pot states for regressive regimes. Obviously, that doesn't apply in the case of the countries that we're talking about, the tariffs here, but it's more about the fact that America has put its interests not only not first, but last in so many different instances. And when we actually flex our muscles, and unapologetically do so, we can cause other countries to actually police their borders. We can cause them to undertake policies that are going to help ultimately redound to our benefit by defending the lives of our people. Look, I think part of the behind the tariffs, which obviously have sort of a catalyzing impact all their own, and it's worth noting, of course, that if when you talk about the Wall Street Journal, and it's really corporate America freaks out about this. Why? Because they like the outsourcing and the globalization that's transpired because they have not put America's national interest first themselves. A lot of large corporations act as if they're citizens of the world instead of American corporations, promoting American goods and services, American workers, et cetera. But I think what's worth emphasizing here is that behind the tariffs, of course, there is the fact that we have the largest and most robust and dynamic marketplace. We have the world's most powerful military still. The fact when it comes to Mexico, for example, that we've talked about designating the cartels, these transnational gangs, as terrorist organizations illustrates a level of seriousness about the nature of the threat. And oh, by the way, to the extent we go that route, what is that going to mean for the financial services companies that have allowed them to make use of their services to finance their operations and to flow funds? What about the government officials on the Mexican side who are going to be found to be complicit in this? So the tariffs also come with an understanding that this is the strongest, most powerful country in the world. It's not afraid to use those powers anymore. And that's why I think you saw immediately Mexico and Canada spring to action and try to come to some kind of negotiated settlement, and we'll see what happens after the 30 days. That's why you've seen Rick Grenell go over to Venezuela, and he comes back with our effective hostages there. And I've seen this in a whole slew of different scenarios that American leaders go out in the world and they come back with the goods for American citizens. And last but not least, I'll note also the focus from Secretary Rubio on our hemisphere first for his first overseas trip. This is the Donroe Doctrine in action, which says we have to focus on our backyard first and foremost. It starts with our borders and what's going on inside our country, but the next sort of level out in these circles of concern is our hemisphere. And obviously, we'll get to that when we talk about the Panama Canal. But I think it's notable that, again, a focus on our own backyard. And this, of course, is being illustrated in these opening tariff actions as well.
All right. With that, I think we pass it on to Ben and the Trump effect on immigration.
Yep. So, the tale is sort of in the numbers as to what the impact has been of the very aggressive Trump administration rollback of Biden open border policies, reinstatement of the policies that persisted under Trump 1 and led to a staunching of the flow of illegal immigration. And then obviously these new, more serious measures as well, some of which we just discussed. On top of the show of force, really, that we've seen from DHS, from ICE in particular, and obviously part of that is photo ops, but the photo ops also have a purpose, which is to communicate a message that the borders are closed now, and you will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. We've seen, I think, reporting today showing that Tom Homan is even threatening to prosecute the governor of my home state, Governor Phil Murphy in New Jersey, who sort of ambiguously was indicating that he was effectively harboring what may be an illegal alien, someone who is not a U.S. citizen within his home. And Tom Homan has said, we're going to investigate that. This reflects, I think, a level of seriousness here from the administration, and it's led to, like I said, the tail and the numbers. At latest look, and this is according to reporting from News Nation, that there's been a 75% plunge in southern border encounters from basically January 20th and the end of the Biden administration through around February 3rd, just before we're recording this. The reason that we've gotten to a trickle now of about 500 plus encounters on the southern border and even less on certain days is completely illustrative of the policies that we've seen in the interior of the homeland, the seriousness of course, activating SOCOM and beyond with respect to policing the borders, the shootouts that have literally taken place with illegal aliens when pursued by authorities, and of course the messaging on top of the policies, which is we're not going to, this country is no longer welcome to illegal aliens, starting with the worst offenders and working all the way down. We've also seen the Trump effect beyond the lack of encounters now, which is a great thing in other ways as well. I mentioned Secretary Rubio going overseas, met with El Salvador's president, who agreed to accept deportees of any nationality and house them in his jails there. Very notable. Beyond that, you've had Colombia basically bending the knee and saying, we're going to accept all deportees. Same thing with Venezuela. And then last but not least, to go back to something I talked about before, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, has said that there's a freeze now on funding to any NGOs that facilitate illegal immigration, and there's going to be a review process. And this is in line with the executive orders that have been put out, including that early one declaring an invasion in the United States and all the policies the administration would undertake to deter and neutralize and end that invasion. This freeze on the funding of NGOs potentially already does implicate hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars annually, because many NGOs in the immigration and adjacent spaces are disproportionately funded with federal dollars. There's no clear record that I've found yet, and I'm doing some reporting on this right now. There's no clear bifurcated record of sort of, here are all of the NGOs in the immigration and adjacent space, and here's what percentage of dollars have gone towards activities facilitating illegal aliens on the chain coming up from the South and then into the country versus what is legitimate activity when it comes to refugee resettlement. What percentage of those refugees are legitimate refugees versus the watered down version of refugees that the Biden administration allowed in under their policies. But this freeze has caused just huge outrage from these organizations, in no small part because they're so heavily disproportionately funded. And they're doing things like, for example, helping provide legal counsel, transportation, food, shelter, etc., to the tune of hundreds of millions in federal funds every single year. That's frozen, and so you have a smaller number of people trying to get in, and then you have these organizations having their funding frozen. There's going to be a question of, is there going to be a backdoor way that they try to use UN funds or funds from other countries overseas to try and continue the policy that was effectuated under the Biden administration? Right now, it doesn't seem like it, and I just go back to the point before about two things. One, if these NGOs couldn't exist without federal funding, should they exist in the forms that they undertook? And then the second aspect is, there's this revolving door, et cetera, but to what extent was the Biden administration colluding with these NGOs to systematically violate immigration laws? And is that an analog to what transpired in the Missouri v. Biden or Murphy v. Missouri case? I think all open questions and all questions that the administration is going to be prosecuting and probing in the months ahead. Curious what you all think about kind of the opening immigration actions and what the effect has been.
Yeah, I mean, I knew they were serious. To your point, Ben, I knew they were serious about enforcing the law when last week they started raiding these offices, like FBI raiding these NGO offices for evidence, essentially, of crime, right? I mean, there's a lot to be said about the point you're making, Ben, about the NGO complex, but I'll save it maybe for final thoughts, other than to say, conveniently, the right-wing network of NGOs, many of them, of course, ineffectual, but it's a constant reminder of how lopsided the playing field has been in these spaces for the left for so long. I can't think of basically a single one of these right-wing, organizations, some of which we work for, media organizations or nonprofits that work on policy. I can't think of a single one that receives major grants from the U.S. government. Like it would be as though the U.S. government were funding Heritage and, my organization, Independent Women, like it would be as though the taxpayer were essentially 90% of our budget every year in grants. And that's been the lopsided playing field for a very long time. But it makes it great because just like with universities, there's a handful of great universities like Hillsdale. They don't take federal money. Very intentionally, they don't take federal money. So it's been the left slush fund for a long time. funding all of these NGOs, universities, organizations, all of these pieces of the leftist machine, they're all dependent on government. And that means they can be shut down to sink or swim. You know what? If George Soros wants to fund it all, he can do it. But there's no reason why the U.S. taxpayer should be funding it. On the border specifically, it's just there's such a huge human cost here to functionally sending out the message to the world. We are not going to enforce our immigration law. If you can get here, you can stay here. There's a human cost to that, obviously, in terms of cartels and trafficking and even sexual assault on our border. I mean, just all kinds of like horrible stuff. But it shows the fact that these crossings are dropping off to such a dramatic extent, and these contacts are dropping off to such a dramatic extent. It just further underlines the fact that, you know, our immigration enforcement doesn't have to be perfect. But when there's a new sheriff in town that is serious about the enforcement, very clearly, things happen very, very fast because the rest of the world actually does get the message very quickly. No, it's not going to benefit you to come illegally to the United States. And it really is that simple.
Yeah, on immigration, I mean, the Trump team is doing some great stuff. I think one of, you know, something that I've been following a lot of is actually this sort of parochial Florida bill. And when you contrast what like the Florida legislature is doing when they're thinking about giving enforcement authority to the Department of Agriculture and cutting out the government entirely with what the Trump administration is doing, it's really dramatic. Team Trump is on top of it. I mean, we're, you know, deporting people to Gitmo, like just, or that's about to start. They're taking it really seriously. And I think it, you know, it fits into the broader theme of, you know, President Trump didn't just take office to be president again. He took office to govern and fix the mistakes of the first term. And it seems like they're fixing them.
I was also following this story where the New Jersey governor, Phil Murphy, announced on television that he is apparently harboring an illegal alien in his attic or something. And I guess to a certain extent, you kind of have to respect it a little bit because he's one of the few Democrats that puts his money where his mouth is, I guess. You'll often see these man on the street videos where conservatives will go around asking liberals who support open borders, well, you know, I have all of these illegal aliens who just came across the border. Can they stay at your house? And they're suddenly like, no, I don't think I would like that very much. But the New Jersey governor is actually doing it. So good for him, I guess. But of course, doing what he's doing, harboring an illegal, is in fact a crime. And Tom Homan was asked about this on Fox News last night. And he said, yep, we're going to investigate. And if he is indeed keeping an illegal alien at the governor's mansion, we're going to make sure we go get him. So this is a very serious operation. Clearly, they did not come to mess around this time, and it's long overdue. I hope that we'll continue to see more stories like this where people are actually held accountable for aiding and abetting, whether it's the NGOs or Governor Murphy, the illegal alien operation that is to the benefit of the cartels, by the way. I mean, they're the ones who decide who actually gets to cross the border from Mexico into the United States. Those are the types of people, the types of violent, horrible people that Phil Murphy and the NGOs are assisting. There's a new sheriff in town, and those groups are no longer going to get a free pass or assistance from the U.S. and its friends.
All right. Next up is my topic, which is the Panama Canal. So we had a pretty dramatic event over the past few days. President Trump again announcing that, you know, he was not happy with the status quo of the Panama Canal and was going to be willing to exercise his rights there and thinks it should be part of the United States again. And then Rubio went down there and met the president of Panama and gave him the bad news. And I mean, it mirrors something that I think is very effective between Rubio and Trump, which is a very effective good cop, bad cop routine, where it's like Rubio is like the polished, nice, you know, Spanish speaking guy who comes in a form is like, you want to give me what I want, because if you don't do that, then you're going to deal with this guy over here, Trump, and he's crazy. Like, he'll do anything. So he'll invade your country. So you do need to get rid of Chinese influence. And the end result of this was the Panamanian president announcing that they were going to terminate their involvement in China's Belt and Road Initiative almost immediately. And that's probably not the end of it. I suspect that, you know, Panama owns or controls rather 2 ports on either side of the canal right now. I suspect that's going to come to an end too. I think Panama realizes that Trump is serious that if he doesn't want the United States military coming in to enforce their rights under the Torrijos-Carter treaties, that China's got to be gone from the canal. There can't be any Chinese corporate involvement in the management of any of the canal's assets, of any infrastructure in the area. And voila, problem, massive geopolitical problem effectively is going to be solved by Trump that wasn't even being discussed under Biden. I mean, when you think about it, what was Biden and their team doing? Just like snoozing on the fact that Panama, the government we gave the canal to so many years ago for nothing, effectively. The canal that massive amounts of American blood and treasure were spent building. We gave, and the entire Panamanian nation was effectively created in order to facilitate that. That used to be part of Colombia, and yet we just handed over the canal. Really, I look back at that. It's just a time where total side note, but Buckley was somebody who was praising handing over the Panama Canal and talked about the spirit of liberty rising up in the hearts of Panamanians. It was utterly absurd, given the fact that we weren't taking over their country. We literally just had a part of the canal that we bought and built, or a part of the country that we bought and built out. Beside the point, what Trump is doing in Panama has again proved to be very effective. And I suspect that, it'll be very good for our ability to project power. I mean, the Panama Canal is extraordinarily important geopolitically. It's the basic place where we need to get our military ships from the Pacific to the Atlantic. It hasn't been managed particularly well. They're having infrastructure problems. It's a huge bottleneck. And very, very clearly, Panama needs to understand that American interests are so substantial that they need to be respected. And it really is, I think somebody pointed out, it's the Don Roe doctrine, right? And because, it's like our Secretary of State is finally focused on the near, on what's happening in our region. For so many years, Blinken was just spending all his time in Europe and the Middle East, basically, and trying to resolve Israel-Palestine. There's actually more important stuff, guys, for you to be handling, our place in our own continent, in our own region, and the countries in our area that are screwing with us. So anyway, I think another good sign of what Trump is up to, and another success for the administration.
Yeah, I love Don Roe doctrine. I don't know if you came up with that, Ben, but it's great. Yeah, I mean, just second everything that Will said about focusing on our hemisphere. This is a critical national interest for the United States, both in terms of national security and in terms of economics. We need to be able to control, or at least to have our interests respected, as Will said, in the Panama Canal. It may not even be necessary for us to take back the canal, right? It may be, it may not be. It depends. But because Trump has set this line of unapologetically asserting our interests, it opens up the possibility for us, for example, to compromise. I think we're getting Greenland too. So this really does feel, I know the Don Roe doctrine is a reference to the Monroe Doctrine, but this feels very TR to me. It feels like turn of the century. And I like it. I think it demonstrates a kind of confidence for a world power to assert its interests in this kind of plain way. Certainly it beats by miles what was happening with the NGO complex and the foreign policy blob that was running USAID for so long in terms of what we were funding around the globe. It certainly makes more sense for us. And frankly, I bet the world will appreciate it too, because it makes us more predictable, right? Having an interest in the Panama Canal is the most predictable, sort of interest for the U.S. to enforce in a normal foreign policy, realpolitik environment. Whereas U.S. caring about, LGBT rights in Yemen, I'm making that last one up, but only slightly, is not. It's also much more difficult for countries to comply with those kinds of requests that likely change and evolve with U.S. social policy. So 3 cheers for the Don Roe doctrine and a return to realpolitik.
It's also worth noting, thinking about the historical kind of basis for this, or lens through which to see it. Really, the policy of focusing on your own backyard, avoiding foreign entanglements, developing deterrent forces, etc. There's really a nexus here. It goes back to John Quincy Adams, and really kind of the policies from Adams era straight through the pre-World War I U.S. era. There's a heritage here. It served America's interests quite well as we started to become a dominant industrial nation, world's most prosperous nation, etc. We prudently used our military forces. By the way, like we developed our navy because of jihadists overseas, for example. Um, all of kind of the broad strokes, the policies that the administration is pursuing on the foreign policy side are very consistent with what the traditional U.S. policy was, and really consistent going back to George Washington's, outgoing speech where he talked about avoiding the foreign entanglements, et cetera. There's a historical legacy here, and this is a link in a chain that had gone broken, I think, really for decades, quite frankly. On the Panama Canal specifically, it's worth emphasizing that Panama essentially said they're not going to renew with China in terms of the Belt and Road relationship. That's really significant as well because the Belt and Road Initiative is what I would call China's kind of loan to own strategy, where they say no strings attached, we're going to finance these massive infrastructure projects for you, et cetera. We're going to develop your 5G network, et cetera. And then lo and behold, when you can't pay up, they seize those assets and it provides sort of launching pads for them around the world. And it's really their preeminent influence operation next to the commercial relations that China has fostered, which serves as an influence lever all its own in capitals across the world. So Panama saying they're not going to renew on Belt and Road is significant, and I wonder if we're going to see this with other nations in our hemisphere and beyond as well. And the other thing that's worth emphasizing is just China clearly plays in our backyard. Iran and its proxies certainly play in our backyard, particularly in Latin America. There's obviously a nexus between adversarial powers and the gangs to our south, the cartels to our south. And that goes from the China link with fentanyl and beyond. It makes inordinate sense, just as a matter of prudence and practicality, that we have to keep these influences out of our hemisphere. Protecting and defending the homeland is the first priority of the commander in chief. That's before we deal with all the other problems out there in the world. So it makes inordinate sense, and it's a sea change in the positive direction that the first focus of the administration is on our hemisphere. Last but not least, I cannot take credit for coining Monroe Doctrine, even though I would like to. It was the New York Post, I believe, that was first on this, but I think we should definitely emphasize it because it captures it nicely.
I don't have much to add here on the Panama Canal, except I would just say this combined with the Mexico-Canada tariff fight illuminated something very simple, which is that all three of the leaders of these countries provided so much bluster at first when Trump talked about these issues either on the campaign trail or after taking office. Certainly, but in the time period between the election and taking office, about how this was never going to happen. America was never going to be able to control the policies of these countries. And all it took was the tiniest iota of pressure for them to immediately cave. And it's an important reminder, I think, for conservative and Republican presidents in particular, that America has all of this soft power that they haven't been using effectively. And it doesn't take that much political will or even diplomacy to affect changes that are good for the American people. We don't have to constantly capitulate to our allies in ways that are detrimental to Americans. You can have an America First policy that, it does involve some level of getting involved in foreign affairs, but not in the sense that we've been doing so over the past 3 decades, which is through regime change wars, endless conflict, etc. You can actually get your allies to take on policies that are good for America and do it outside of sort of neoconservative nation building type approaches.
All right, with that, final thoughts. My final thought is like, I want to talk a little bit about you actually, what, pass that. I'm going to pass somebody else because I had it. I can't remember what it was. So somebody else go.
I'll throw out a really brief one, which is, and obviously this is all happening in real time, but we're recording on Tuesday. It looks like we're going to have RFK Jr. already voted out of committee, and then it appears that the Senate Intelligence Committee panel, which was showing some resistance to Tulsi Gabbard, it now looks like all of the wobblies have come around. And so presumably they will get floor votes and presumably they will prevail on the Senate floor. Um, First of all, it's really, you want to talk about violating norms. The fact that you have the president's own party that is so resistant to these picks, that's a violation of norms from the mushy establishment. But nevertheless, it seems like the whipping operation has been effective. I'd still like the senators not to go away on retreats, not to take the weekends off, et cetera, because it's an imperative that these nominees get in place. It's amazing what the administration has been able to execute without the principles actually in place, and they probably planned for the trench warfare that was coming. But it's going to be incumbent upon the Senate to help facilitate the flow of the administration's personnel and policies. And that is still going to be ground zero for the resistance. Beyond the sabotage that we see going on, like you have FBI officials, for example, already starting to resist big time in terms of what the administration is trying to do there, in terms of canning some personnel. You're going to have the Republicans in the Senate who are going to be the primary stumbling block potentially to the mandate, to achieving what needs to be achieved in what may only be a 2-year period of trifecta control. So the focus needs to remain on Republican senators. We'll see what happens with to what extent Russ Vogt's nomination is expedited, because if you want to ultimately implement these policies, oversee these policies, faithfully execute them, and that's on spending, that's on regulation, and really every area, you need someone like Russ Vogt, and specifically Russ Vogt in at OMB. So we'll have to stand by and keep watching, but so far it really appears that Trump is going to get his nominees, and that's a sadly, I mean, that constitutes a major win. But when you consider where Republicans in the Senate are, particularly the older establishment members who are recalcitrant and resistant to Trump and the political victories that he's brought, it looks like none of these nominees are going to be failed nominees so far. And that's a huge benefit to the country.
Yeah, my final thought is a word on the constitutionality of all of this, because we're starting to hear the squawking from the left, who has, suddenly discovered the Constitution after ignoring it for decades, and calling it the work of dead white men, irrelevant dead white men. The reason most of this stuff is possible is because for decades, Congress has been giving away its power to legislate to the executive branch. And functionally, what was happening was Congress is writing these pieces of legislation, like even the 1961 Act that I was talking about with USAID, right? They're writing this legislation at the most gauzy, vague of levels, right? They're saying, okay, here's some general goals. Okay, let me kick the actual meat and potatoes work of legislating, which, by the way, has the potential to piss off people and piss off my voters. So I'm just going to kick it quietly to the executive agencies and count on the fact that the executive agencies, by the way, USAID specifically, apparently 97% of the federal employee donations from that agency went to Democrats in the last cycle. I mean, the federal bureaucracy is essentially the wing of the Democratic Party that doesn't have to stand for election. And it was a very convenient agreement in some sense for both parties to just kick over legislating to what is functionally a Democratic left-wing apparatus of bureaucrats and agencies who would do those kinds of decisions would make those kinds of legislating decisions so that the politicians could go and grandstand in front of their voters and say whatever they wanted, right? They can say, oh, we're against this, right? Even though they enabled it through legislation, through this vague legislation, they can go ahead and tell their voters, no, I'm not in favor of that unpopular piece of spending, for example. And this just really worked for all sides involved for a very long time. And it's that illegitimate government structure that is being busted up now. All Trump is doing is taking actual executive control of the executive branch. The reason he can do all this is because the legislation doesn't say spend X amount of dollars on, LGBT propaganda in Yemen. It doesn't say that, right? It says support the president's foreign policy. Here are some vague goals. Okay. And that has been translated by the bureaucracy into a permanent left-wing apparatus, funding apparatus. That funding apparatus is vulnerable because they didn't legislate, because it is functionally illegal. The constitutional arguments here are firmly on the side of the Trump administration, which is just taking control of its own branch of government. If Congress wants to stop any of this, they can legislate. They haven't been legislating, and that's why all of this is possible. And by the way, if you think that what Trump is doing with these vague appropriations is unconstitutional, then great, I agree with you. Then 90% of the federal bureaucracy and everything it's been doing for the last 30 years is unconstitutional, and we should shut it down tomorrow. I suspect that's not where these people want to go with that argument, but it is functionally. Essentially, the only reason the Trump administration can do this is because the left has been governing illegitimately and unconstitutionally for decades. So, I mean, to my mind, not only is this great in terms of all of the substance, this is the most optimistic I've ever been about us actually returning to our three branches of government, Bill on a Hill type stuff. He is probably the greatest restorer of constitutional norms in a century.
My final thoughts are on the fight between Doge and some of the government agencies. Right now, the big one at time of filming is Treasury, where employees, and USAID, where employees have tried to basically block Doge employees from coming in and looking at the financial records, which is not going well for them. But to get a little bit more into the weeds here, there's been some reporting on who some of Elon Musk's sort of star employees are at this sort of independent committee, and they're all between the ages of like 22 and 25 years old, and they all appear to be exceptionally gifted. In fact, one of them decoded like an ancient scroll that nobody else could decode when he was 20 years old. And my friend Peyton Alexander has this amazing tweet where he points out the amazing achievements of some of these young men, and then points out that the author who wrote the hit piece about them has a biography on his byline page saying that he is an associate staff writer for general topics. Hobbies include having a cat and appearing in PC Magazine, and also, quote, loves to sleep. So there's this amazing dichotomy between some of the individuals who have been chosen to take on this sort of Herculean task of cutting government spending, and then the lazy, completely inept journalists who are criticizing them for their efforts. It's sort of the perfect characterization of like meritocracy versus failing upwards in like liberal think piece world. And I'm just loving watching this play out.
Yeah. All right. So my final thought, I realize, is I'm headed to Israel next week. I'm really excited about it with various other people affiliated with NatCon. And, you know, getting the chance to ask a bunch of questions of officials. So if people have any idea like what I should be asking or what, you know, what they want to hear, they should DM me on Twitter. And I'll be happy to do that. I think, you know, Israel's sort of taken a little bit of a backseat finally in the news because they've, you know, effectively, you know, they're in the middle of this hostage deal and a lot of the imminent pressure has been resolved, but I've never been there before. I'm really excited to go. All right, with that, I think that's everything. So on behalf of Ben, Amber, and Inez, thanks for tuning in. I'm Will Chamberlain. See you at the next NatCon Squad.